Turn on your projectors and follow me down the rabbit hole. JJ Hatter welcomes you to Analysis in Wonderland. Today's topic, Tim Burton's Alice movies. It's the 5th week of the series, and it's time to talk about two of the most recent and prominent takes on the Wonderland stories, the Disney-produced, Tim Burton-directed 2010 blockbuster Alice in Wonderland, and its sequel, Alice Through the Looking Glass, co-produced by Burton and this time directed by James Bobbin. Oh boy. Okay, as usual, before I get into my thoughts on these films as a whole, let's go over a bit of the production history. The first of Burton's Alice movies was announced as early as 2008 as being in production. The project started as part of a contract fulfillment. Burton was looking to create a feature-length remake of his 1984 televised short subject, Frankenweenie. The rights to that film went to Disney, and when Burton came in to see about creating such a piece, Disney agreed on the condition that he first direct a live-action version of Alice in Wonderland. Burton, rather surprisingly I feel, openly admitted that he never really cared much for the 1951 animated feature, or, even more surprising, the original Carol stories. As I've said before, the biggest complaint I often hear about Alice in general is that it doesn't really have a clearly defined plot or even much of a point. And while these made it revolutionary in its day and can still make it interesting when handled well, Burton, like numerous other people, felt alienated as a result. I find this especially ironic since Burton-saturated films like Batman Returns tend to also have plots that jump all over the place. But I suppose one could argue that situation isn't quite the same, so what are you gonna do? At any rate, the movie was produced on a budget of roughly $200 million. Screenwriter Linda Woolverton, who had gained major kudos at Disney working on some of their animated features, such as Beauty and the Beast and Mulan, was hired on to adapt the story in a manner that would please Tim Burton and the rest of the creative team. As director, Burton saw the film as a possible opportunity to take advantage of a medium he actually wasn't extremely familiar with, CGI effects and animation. He saw the film as a chance to experiment and wanted to deliberately use the sort of uncanny valley effect computer-generated imagery can cause to help build the strange and twisted Wonderland he envisioned in his mind. Once again, the film was cast with many major stars and noted character actors, most of them English or Australian, and several of them Burton regulars, such as Johnny Depp, Helena Bonham Carter, Christopher Lee, and Michael Gough. The latter two received cameos. Other names attached to the project were Stephen Fry, Anne Hathaway, Alan Rickman, Barbara Windsor, Matt Lucas, and Michael Sheen. Mia Wasikowska, an actress who had gained some recognition for her role in the HBO series In Treatment, was picked to play Alice herself. Good old Danny Elfman, who I swear at this point must be Tim Burton's long-lost brother or something and neither of them will admit it, was chosen to compose the music for the picture. The movie was released to polarizing reviews, but also to major box office returns, earning well over $1 billion. To date, it is among the top 30 highest-grossing movies of all time, and was a major hit in the careers of everyone involved. The movie was basically responsible for the current live-action age of Disney we seem to be going through, leading to such films as Oz the Great and Powerful, Maleficent, and Cinderella. A sequel was inevitable, and it arrived in 2016 as Alice Through the Looking Glass. Many of the same cast and crew members returned for the project, and Sacha Baron Cohen was brought on to play a new character, none other than Time himself. However, in stark contrast to the previous movie, this one, though equally distressing in terms of its reviews, was a box office bomb. It was made for about the same amount of money, but made less than $300 million in comparison, effectively killing the franchise. It's been almost 10 years since the first Tim Burton movie came out, and a little over 3 years since the sequel limped its way out of theaters like the victim of a car wreck. Critics and audiences alike were very, very split about these films, and still are, and the loudest voices seem to be the most negative. So the question in the case of this franchise isn't so much does it hold up, but rather, does it deserve all the hate? As a new decade draws near, is there anything worth defending, or was it all a fad that deserved its relatively quick demise? I'm going to be honest with you people, I am very, very torn about these movies. There is not enough paper in the world to describe my thoughts. I decided to review them together for several reasons, rather than look at each one separately, but before I get into the real analysis, I have to be upfront and say that even as we speak, I'm not entirely sure what to make of these films. Part of this is due to some personal history I have with them. When the first film came out in 2010, I was in my early teens, and I was around that time I was really starting to get into my obsession with these stories. So needless to say, when I found out my all-time favorite director and several of my favorite actors were involved in a project based on my favorite books, I was hyped. When I saw the film, I'm not going to lie, I adored it. It was one of my new favorite movies. For about a year or two. I was basically Burton Alice trash for that point of time. In the years that followed, I think almost up until the time the second film came out, I wrote about a dozen or more fanfics set in the universe of these movies, and read dozens more. Many of them on both sides have never been finished, and in the case of my own stories, I'm not sure if they ever will be, but that's another issue. The thing was that the more I collected of Wonderland, and the more I grew and changed as a person from that point on, the more I started to see the flaws of the film, and the more I began to grow frustrated with it. By the time the sequel came out, I was excited, but also cautious. And I'll be honest, I wasn't really that surprised it failed, though I was not anticipating it to flop as badly as it did. I think part of the problem stems from the fact that the movies are confused, so to speak. This is evident just from the titles and the premise. The two pictures feature a grown-up Alice returning to Wonderland, presumably after her original adventures sometime in the past. However, the titles are just Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. As a result, many people complain that the movies have nothing to do with the books. Of course they don't. These stories come after those stories. But if that's the case, why give the pictures those titles? If you just change the title of the 2010 film to, say, Back to Wonderland, I think most people would shut up there. However, it doesn't help that Burton claimed the picture wasn't meant to be a sequel or a reimagining, despite the very obvious fact that it is both those things. If the director's intent and the final product are so drastically different, what hope does a project have? Putting that aside, if we look at these movies for what they are, reinterpretations and sequels to the stories, rather than strict adaptations of the stories themselves, how do they work out? Are they really as bad as everyone makes them out to be? I can't say they're bad, but they're not very good either. It's a little like the 1933 film made by Paramount. These films are a couple of mixed bags, and the elements that work and don't work between them tend to even each other out. Most people seem to prefer one of the films over the other, but I personally like both roughly the same in terms of overall quality. Their pros and their cons run parallel courses. Some of the things wrong with the first film are improved in the second, some of the things that worked well in the first film are totally broken in the second, and some things between the two work about as well or as badly in both cases. Therefore, I'm going to take a look at both films comparatively before I analyze them comprehensively. Let's start with the cast and characters. The most consistent character between both movies, I feel, is the White Queen, played by Anne Hathaway. In this version, most of the Wonderland characters are given proper names as well as titles. The Queen's name is Mirana. In the first film, while Mirana is ostensibly the good Queen of Wonderland, there are several hints throughout the story that she's actually got quite a bit of a dark side to her, and feels guilt and regret about things in her past, which makes her rather interesting. In the second film, this becomes a major plot point, as we discover she was actually the favored child all her life, and took advantage of this on more than one occasion, causing a rift to form between herself and her sister, Erasabeth, the Queen of Hearts. And yes, I will be calling her the Queen of Hearts, not the Red Queen. If any of you wish to complain about this, I would suggest taking it up with the Bandersnatch from Resident Evil, while riding a unicycle. The character of Father Time, or simply Time if you prefer, only appears in the second film, and he's pretty interesting as well. The concept of the character comes out of the first book, where the Hatter claims he had a quarrel with Time, and thus Time froze him and his friends in time, thus causing the everlasting insanity of the Mad Tea Party. However, the idea of Time as a physical character is relatively unique. The only other reimagining of Alice I know of that features a character based on Time is the manga Alice in the Country of Hearts, with the character of Julius the Clockmaker. An odd thing about the advertising for the sequel was that it really seemed to build up Time as a villain, but instead he turns out to be a very comical and even sympathetic character, in no way a villain at all. He's a lot of fun and fits in this universe very nicely, and steals the show in the sequel from top to bottom. Between these two, the rest of the major cast seems to flip-flop. Mia Wasikowska as Alice Kingsley in the first film seems very passive, even during many of the more action-packed moments. There is energy to what she does, and she's clearly trying, but you get the feeling the actress herself is almost as lost as Alice is, and she comes across as somewhat bland as a result. I suppose the idea is that she's supposed to be reserved and normal in comparison to all the nuttiness around her, which often is the case in other versions, but the movie goes on and on to describe Alice as abnormal, so it feels like a strange juxtaposition. She has her moments, but it's ultimately not the most engaging piece of work. In the sequel, she's much more active and emotional, and really becomes a character you can root for and find interesting, as we see more of her flaws, but also more of her personal strengths. And that's the other side of the issue. We see them. We aren't just told about them like the first movie seems to try. You of course can't talk about the cast without discussing Johnny Depp as the Mad Hatter, called Terrence Hightopp, and Helena Bonham Carter as the Queen of Hearts. In the first film, I actually thought both did a really good job. Some people found Depp's performance confusing, with the changing voice, the crazy design, and so forth. But I knew what was going on, and found it fascinating. Sure, he was over the top, but as I've said before, Wonderland isn't a world for subtlety. As for Carter, her Queen of Hearts was childish and silly, as the character often is, but at times she could also be rather intimidating and even a little sympathetic. Of all the villains over the years who have gotten a more empathetic treatment, the Queen of Hearts has rarely been among them, and Carter did a fine job, in my opinion, of making you care for this character no matter how horrible she was. In the second film, however, good lord, I swear the two are just playing parodies of themselves. Any threatening vibes the Queen had are totally obliterated, and in terms of her sympathy, her motivations are gone into further, but they feel so weak in comparison to the first film that it almost feels like two totally different characters. Depp's Hatter is much the same, his already melodramatic moments exaggerated to the point of corny pantomime, and he slurs so much in his speech in the second film I swear he was sleepwalking through at least half the picture. Just because Wonderland is a world where you can go over the top, as I said, it doesn't mean there's no limit to how batty you can be. These performances in the second film exemplify that. When people complain that these two actors only play themselves, I usually disagree. But the 2016 movie is a case where I feel I must go with the majority vote. As for the other characters, they tend to be hit or miss. They're all played by great actors, but their roles tend to be fairly minor compared to the others I've already mentioned. There are two possible exceptions. One is Alan Rickman as Absalom the Caterpillar. He's wonderful in the first film, but only appears briefly near the beginning of the second. Apparently Absalom was going to be in more of the sequel, but Rickman sadly passed away while the movie was in production and the script had to be changed, which may have also led to some of the other problems in the film, come to think of it. The other is Crispin Glover as Elosevic Stain, the Knave of Hearts. He's a deliciously slimy character, but he's totally gypped in the sequel, never even mentioned, aside from a short cameo where he's dead. Story and tone are the next two things that need to be looked at. Many people compare these films, especially the first, to the Chronicles of Narnia. Indeed, the first film not only features a dormouse, who I swear must be Reepicheep's sister, but its action-packed focus on adventure and its basic story of trying to save a fantasy land from an evil queen with help from a group of ragtag heroes and slaying a dragon-like creature with a magic sword not only bears striking resemblances to some of the Narnia stories, but dozens upon dozens of other fantasy novels, films, and so on we've seen tons of times before. The themes present in it are pretty stock too, having been explored much better in many other movies, including other takes on Alice in the past, and arguably in much more inventive and interesting ways. On top of this, the tone is rather scattershot. The color palette tends to be rather dingy and mysterious, really trying to capture the idea of a decaying wonderland that's slowly dying, and there are several dark and downright disturbing scenes and moments throughout the tale. But then you also have this nonsense. Yeah, this, I'm not saying anything about it, I refuse. Boo! Hiss! I won't bring it up again. However, with all this said, it may be sort of standard fantasy fare, but it's not necessarily done badly. And I kind of like this war-torn Wonderland world. It's also a concept that's been done before and since, but it's just a universe I like to see and imagine, especially in the Tim Burton style. There's also some subtlety with a lot of the characters, a lot of things left ambiguous, more than I think people give it credit for. So there's still some richness to it you might not expect. The second film is more consistent. It does have a much more lighthearted tone, not only in terms of the colors used and its sense of storytelling approach, but even the dark moments in it are not that dark in comparison, at least in terms of the way they are presented. However, while the tone is more consistent, the story comes across as very, very rushed. and a lot of the motivations and even plot elements don't really make sense when compared to the continuity and issues raised from the first movie. It doesn't help that the second film has several cliches of its own, some of which don't even add up. It lacks the nuances in the characters and the more urgent desperation of the first film for most of the runtime. I will say, however, that I like the themes of time and memory that are toyed with here, and the way the concept of time travel is depicted in this world is rather interesting, both in terms of how it works and the kinds of problems it can cause. One thing I genuinely like more in the second film is the special effects and the visual design. While I do still like the first film's style, even watching it in 3D as I did when it first came out, it never really sucked me in all that much. I'm not sure I can explain why or how. In the second film, however, honestly, watching it in 3D there, I never felt more enveloped in a movie in all my life, and I say that with complete and total knowledge of what that indicates. When Alice and Time go flying through the sea of time, I seriously felt like I was in the ocean around them. When Alice visits the Mad Hatter's house, I seriously thought I was in that house. Because of the fact Wonderland, at least at the start of the story, is now perfectly healthy, so to speak, it's allowed to be much more vibrant in color and design, and there's even more practical effects and set pieces added to the mix with less emphasis on CGI, although there's still plenty done in the computer too. At the end of the day, both films have their weaknesses and strengths, and it's hard to say which is really the better story. I guess in summation, I'd say the first film has the weaker protagonist and less appealing sense of aesthetic style, but the stronger antagonist and more colorful and engaging side characters. In contrast, the second film has the stronger protagonist and a much more enveloping sense of scope and style, but the other characters and the main antagonist, with the exception of Time, are much less interesting and fun to watch. Both have a lot of cliches, but also deal with some new stuff in terms of their plot lines, so take them each for what they are worth. And so we come to the conclusions. Rating, 6 out of 10, The Hatter's Average. There is no solid rating I can give this series that would please everyone, including myself. As far as serious cinema goes, these movies aren't the worst in the world, and as long as you know what you're getting into, you might actually have fun with them. But if you don't know what you're getting into, or just don't like these kind of stories, you probably won't get much out of them, and I think that's why so much hatred has come about. I personally enjoy them whenever I revisit them, and several versions of these characters are among my favorites, but they're ultimately very jumbled and messy. But hey, other things have been jumbled and messy and gotten more praise, so just keep an open mind if you decide to view these or revisit them. Top 6 performances and characters. Anne Hathaway as Mirana the White Queen. She may not be the most active character in the movies, but she is the most consistent, and Hathaway gives a great performance as a character who's not as pure and sweet as she always seems. Stephen Fry as the Cheshire Cat. I really wish I could put this kitty higher. Named Cheshire in this universe, Fry's voice is absolutely perfect, and the character design is simply phenomenal. Easily my favorite look for the character to date. But there are some issues with him in the first film I can't ignore after revisiting the picture, and he's practically invisible in the second movie. Then again, he's the Cheshire Cat, so I suppose being invisible is his sort of thing. Helena Bonham Carter is the Queen of Hearts, Irascibeth, but only for the first film. Once again, the character design is spectacular, and her performance in that movie really works in my opinion. I just wish the sequel held a candle to it. Barbara Windsor as the Dormouse. Okay, so she's basically a female Despero and has next to nothing to do with the character in the book, but for some reason I just really like this character. Johnny Depp as the Mad Hatter, but again, only for the first film. This is probably a controversial choice, since I know a lot of people don't like Depp's work or design in these films, but I personally didn't mind at all in the first movie. And Sacha Baron Cohen as Time. He only shows up in the second film, and thus does not have to worry about getting gypped in the other. I was initially put off by what I perceived as false advertising regarding his role and personality, but I now see him as a unique, fun, and charming character. Next time, we conclude this 6-part series. What Wonderland will we explore next? Just wait and see.